So, final presentation for this week. We are now looking at the period of the Second Intifada, the years 2000, 2004-5. This is a rather violent period. It's actually one of the worst times in the recent history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All the tensions that were unresolved from the Oslo Accords or from the Oslo years re-emerged very violently. The conventional date for the starting of the Second Intifada is the beginning, maybe the first few days of September 2000, when Ariel Sharon walked on the in the mosques, in the area of the mosques of the temple area, so to speak, in Jerusalem, sparking a wave of violent demonstrations that continued in a very violent way for more than 4 or 5 years. We're talking of an intifada which is exponentially more brutal than the first intifada, with more than 5,000 Palestinians and more than 1,000 Israelis dead as a result of military operations, searches and arrests, undercover operations, targeted killings, suicide terrorism, and internal Palestinian political conflict. So we're talking of a time where it's really very difficult to find examples of non-violent activism. Nevertheless, because this course is about this, I think it's important to shed a little bit of light, the little light that there is in the darkness of these years. Also remember that in 2002, the Israeli government decided to build a separation barrier in order to fence off or to keep out or to make more difficult the entrance of suicide bombers into Israel, claiming that it is for its self-defense and for the defense of its citizens that Israel is doing so. You can find a definition of the separation barrier in your glossary for this week. Many activists, many say it's Israel's right to build the separation wall if so it wants, but it should do it along internationally recognized borders while it actually eats up the route, which has been redesigned several times, but the route of the wall happens to be not so much on the green line, on the border, internationally recognized border between Israel and the Palestinian territories. Rather, it runs in the Palestinian territories, eating up some land, not little land from the territories. The separation barrier is an important element in this. If we look at activism during non-violent or anyway activism during the Second Intifada, as most demonstrations that most non-violent demonstrations that took place at that time happened, in fact, in places where the separation barriers where the construction of the separation barrier would lead to the uprooting of trees or the separation of the community of the village from its olive trees that actually helped provide a living for the Palestinian communities of a given area. So the main problem, one of the main problems, was cutting off the villagers from their farm lands. So, first of all, what is the connection between the first Intifada and the second? Apparently, there is very little that connects the two, but as the studies and the interviews of Julie Norman have demonstrated, the experience of activists and militants or prisoners of the first Intifada were instrumental in motivating the resistance leaders of the second Intifada to reclaim a space for popular resistance. And the majority of the leaders, the civil resistance leaders in the second Intifada, based their actions on an activist identity that they attributed to their involvement in the first Intifada. So, for example, as one of the interviewees of Julie Norman says, his name is, his fictional name, I believe, is Noor, and he said, during the first Intifada, I felt that I did something, and it gave me a commitment to continue. I felt something in my heart, and I adopted that feeling afterwards. And again, another one that was instrumental, was among the organizers in the campaign Stop the Wall, which is one of the movements considered to use nonviolent strategies to challenge the separation barrier, in fact. So another one that who's identified as Mahmoud, he said, we created the campaign out of our experiences, looking to get back the way of resistance that we admired. So the first Intifada came to represent what Julie Norman calls the one of the factors that gave gave activists a core identity. So here is the title of the article that you can find in your documents, which is included in this bibliography. And what Julie Norman says is basically that most of the campaigns, the nonviolent campaigns that took place during the Second Intifada were against or in response to the construction of the separation barrier. But then they transformed into a nucleus or a nexus of resistance to the occupation itself. There were many areas in the West Bank where this happened. For example, in Bil'in, near Ramallah, there were weekly demonstrations against the wall, and there have been since January 2005. Another is very important story of nonviolent resistance is that of Budrus, of the village of Budrus. And we will see in a minute some further information about this. However, popular participation in nonviolent resistance remained fragmented and limited, in contrast, in a way, to the mass mobilization of the First Intifada. And looking at Perlman's, Wendy Perlman definition or terminology, we can say that in the First Intifada, the movement was resilient and it was able to withstand challenges such as crackdowns, imprisonments, economic hardship. And during the Second Intifada, the national movement was brittle. It crumbled and it fractured under the very same or very similar pressures. This was also due in part to the structure of the Palestinian Authority as a state-like institution, which, however, was operating under a military occupation. At the same time, activists expressed their disillusionment, and frustration with parties and individuals inside the Palestinian Authority. Now, two of the most successful campaigns, non-violent campaigns, that it's worth mentioning here have been captured and told in movies. And the first one is Budrus, in fact, produced by the NGO Just Vision. We will talk about Just Vision in our fifth week when we talk about media and the involvement of media and communication in reporting about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and where the spotlight falls and which NGOs work for putting the spotlight on non-violent stories. So the story of Budrus and its non-violent resistance for rerouting the barrier, the separation barrier from their village farmlands to a different route is told in this movie. And here you have some pictures of such non-violent resistance, as well as the participation of women, which was very which emerges very strongly in the movie. So Budrus is one example of this non-violent commitment and mobilization. And the second movie that I certainly recommend, that I think it's important, is a testimony of the resistance in the village of Bil'in. This is a very good movie by Eyad Bernat and Guy Davidi. And here in a it's very small, but there is somehow the graphic synopsis of the movie that explains the kind of mobilization against the construction of the barrier and the uprooting of trees in the village of Bil'in. So to sum up, we can say that the memory of mobilization of the first Intifada was a motivating factor for many individual activists looking for a spirit of resistance, a collective spirit of resistance in the second Intifada. But it's also evident that the activist identity that was shared by many of these individuals who often participated in the first Intifada was more visible at a personal than at a collective level, and that a widespread popular movement for non-violence, we can certainly say that it never truly emerged in the second Intifada. So that closes our week, and thank you for your patience, for being here throughout this whole very long week, and I'll see you next week or whenever you want for Unit 3, which talks about gender activism and women and queer activism. Thank you very much, and have a good weekend, I hope. Ciao.